Imagine you're in a crowd of 38,000 people. The lights are down, the air is electric, you've waited hours for this moment, and now, finally, the show has started. You're at Wembley Stadium in London. The year is 1988, and the man on that stage is the most famous entertainer on the planet. You're singing every word, you know every move before he makes it. You've dreamed about this night for months. And then, right in the middle of the show, everything stops. The music cuts. The performer walks to the edge of the stage. He crouches down and signals to security. And within a few minutes, one person, just one person out of 38,000, is being helped carefully through the crowd toward the front. Nobody knows who she is. Nobody knows why she was chosen. And when she finally gets to the front of that barrier and Michael Jackson leans down to speak to her, what she says into that microphone changes the entire temperature of the room. Not just for her, for every single person in that stadium. 38,000 strangers ended that night holding each other, crying, not because of any song, not because of any choreography or costume or pyrotechnic, but because of something true that a dying woman said on a warm summer night in London and the way one man chose to respond to it. This is that story, and I promise you, by the time we're done, you're going to see Michael Jackson in a way that most people never got to see him. Before we dive in, if you're the kind of person who loves real human stories like this one, stories that get under your skin and stay there, hit subscribe right now. I find these moments, stories that happened in front of thousands of people but somehow never quite made the headlines, and I think they're the most important ones. So subscribe and let's get into it. To really understand what happened at Wembley that night, you have to understand the world Michael Jackson was living in at the time. Because 1988 isn't just any random year, it's the height of everything. It's the peak of the mountain. The Bad World Tour had been running since September of 1987. It had already swept through Japan, where Michael sold out 14 consecutive shows at the Korakuen Stadium, which was unprecedented. He had played Australia, he had crossed the United States, and now he was midway through a European leg that would eventually become the highest-attended solo concert tour in recorded history up to that point. Think about that for a second, not the biggest tour of the year, the biggest solo tour in history, period, full stop. And the numbers back it up. By the time the Bad World Tour was done, Michael Jackson had performed 123 concerts across 15 countries to a total audience of 4.4 million people. The gross revenue was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. No single artist had done anything close to it. But those numbers, as staggering as they are, don't really tell you what it was like to be inside one of those shows. Here's what you need to understand about the Bad era. Michael had developed his craft to a level that almost defies description. He had been performing professionally since he was 5 years old. By 1988, that was nearly 25 years of work. 25 years of learning audiences, learning stages, learning how bodies move and how sound travels, and how a room responds to a held note versus a syncopated beat. The Bad World Tour show that he put on wasn't just a concert. It was a precision machine. Every song had its place in the arc of the night. Every costume change was timed to the second. The dancers knew exactly where to be. The lighting director had cues that matched the music down to individual beats. The sound engineers knew the frequencies of each specific stadium they were walking into. Michael himself had rehearsed the choreography so many thousands of times that his body executed it on a kind of automatic recall, which freed his attention during the show to do something that separated him from virtually every other performer of his generation. He could read the crowd, not in a vague, general sense, not just noticing whether people were excited or bored. He could read individual sections, individual faces. He had developed over those 25 years a peripheral awareness of human texture in a room that was almost uncanny. He could feel when a section of the crowd was slightly behind the rest. He could sense when the energy in the front rows was building towards something that needed a release. He could identify, in a crowd of tens of thousands of people, the one face that wasn't doing what every other face around it was doing. That ability is what mattered on the night of July 16th, 1988. The show started at 9 p.m. The London sky had done something unusual that evening. It had been genuinely warm. Not English warm, not the apologetic, tentative warmth that London usually offers in July, but actually warm. The kind of evening that feels like a gift. And 38,000 people had been packed into Wembley Stadium since 5 o'clock. which meant that by the time the lights went down, the combined heat of all those bodies had raised the temperature inside the venue to something that felt almost tropical. The crowd was at a particular pitch. There's a specific energy that large concert crowds reach after they've been waiting long enough that the waiting itself becomes a kind of performance. The anticipation had layered on itself for 4 hours, and when Michael hit that stage, the release of all that pent-up energy was seismic. He opened with Wanna Be Startin' Something, then Human Nature, then Smooth Criminal. The set was moving exactly as it was supposed to move. The crowd was giving everything back, matching him beat for beat, lyric for lyric. And then, 43 minutes in, Michael moved to the front of the stage for the slower middle section of the set. And he saw her. She was in the 6th row, center section, close enough to the stage that in the sea of upturned, singing, swaying faces, she should have been indistinguishable from everyone around her. And in terms of proximity to the stage, she was exactly where dozens of other people were standing. But she wasn't doing what the people around her were doing. The people around her were lost in it, arms up, singing along, moving with that unself-conscious joy that only really happens when music has arrived fully inside you, and your body starts responding before your mind has time to think about whether it looks cool or not. They were giving themselves over to the experience completely. She was sitting still, not bored, not checked out, not the stillness of someone who doesn't want to be there. Something different. The stillness of someone using everything they have just to be present. She was perhaps 30 years old, and she had the particular quality of someone who had been seriously ill for a long time, a kind of translucence, a fragility that isn't a metaphor but a physical reality, the way the body looks when it has been fighting something for months or years, and the fight is starting to show on the surface. She was watching the stage, not watching Michael the way the crowd was watching him, not tracking the choreography, not mouthing the lyrics. She was watching him with the concentrated, almost ferocious attention of someone who is trying to hold the experience in their mind completely, who is storing it, who knows this might need to last. Michael noticed her, not through any deliberate searching. His eyes didn't sweep the crowd looking for someone interesting. It was that peripheral awareness kicking in, that thing that develops over decades of reading rooms. An anomaly in the human texture of the crowd that registered without being directed to. He finished the song he was performing, and then he walked to the very edge of the stage and crouched down. In live performance terms, crouching at the edge of the stage is an intimacy move. It brings the performer physically closer to the crowd level. It changes the geometry of the relationship between stage and audience. It says, I am coming toward you. I am closing the distance. I see you specifically. He signaled to the security team. The protocol was understood. Michael occasionally brought people forward. It wasn't unheard of. He would sometimes pull fans onto the stage or bring someone forward to receive a scarf or a rose from the production. The security team was trained for it. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had rehearsed a scenario enough times that executing it felt almost like muscle memory. Getting through a crowd of 38,000 people to the 6th row takes time. It took 4 minutes. The crowd around her shifted to allow it, the way crowds shift when something is happening that they don't yet understand but already recognize as significant. There's a collective intelligence in a crowd that activates in moments like that. Nobody needed to be told that this was something real. She was helped forward gently, one security team member on each side, and she moved slowly, the careful walk of someone for whom movement requires a calculation that most people never have to make. How much energy does this cost? What will I have left? Is this worth it? Yes, it is. When she reached the front barrier, Michael was already there, crouched at the edge. He said, "What's your name?" She said her name was Caroline. Her voice came through the microphone that Michael's team had extended toward her. Not loud, but clear. Clear enough that the people in the rows around her could hear it. Clear enough that the microphone caught it and sent it through the PA system, which meant that 38,000 people heard a woman named Caroline say her name in Wembley Stadium. Michael asked her how she was doing. And here is the moment. Here is the thing that changed the night. She looked at him for a second, just a beat, the pause of someone who has made a decision about something. And she said, "I have cancer. I probably won't be here next year. I just wanted to see you one more time." 38,000 people heard that. and 38,000 people went completely silent. I want you to really sit with that for a second, because it's hard to convey how extraordinary that is. A stadium that had been generating a continuous wall of sound since 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 38,000 people who had been singing, screaming, cheering for over 4 hours. And in the space of 2 sentences from a woman none of them had ever met, the entire building went quiet. Not the quiet of people being asked to be quiet, not a hush from the stage, just the natural, instinctive silence that descends on human beings when they are in the presence of something true. Michael Jackson stayed crouched at the edge of that stage for a long moment. And here's what's important to understand about those few seconds. His face didn't perform anything. He didn't arrange his expression into the face that a person makes when they want the crowd to see they're moved. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't look out at the audience. He looked at Caroline. There's a difference, and it matters, between a face that is performing emotion and a face that is simply holding it. One is a presentation. The other is a window, and what the people closest to the stage described was a window. Someone receiving something real and treating it with the weight it deserved. He stood up. He turned to his band and said something. Nobody in the audience could hear it. The musicians heard it, obviously, but we'll get to what they experienced in a bit. From the crowd, all anyone could see was Michael Jackson having a quiet word with his band. Then he turned back to the microphone, and he addressed all 38,000 people. He said, "I need everyone in this building to do something for me right now. I need you to show Caroline that she is not alone." Now, what happened next was not a cheer. If you've been to big concerts, you know the sound a stadium makes when it's being told to make noise. It's loud, it's joyful, it's almost aggressive in its energy. It's the sound of a crowd that has been given permission to release something. This wasn't that. What happened was something more sustained and more complex. 38,000 people turned their full and complete attention toward one woman standing at the front barrier of Wembley Stadium. And the combined weight of that attention, the focused, deliberate act of 38,000 people choosing to see one person, arrived as something almost physical. People who were in the upper tiers of the stadium said they could see the moment it reached her, even from that distance. Could see the shift in how she was standing, like something that had been braced against something else suddenly didn't need to be braced anymore, like a held breath released. Michael's team brought her onto the stage. She stood beside him, in front of 38,000 people, in the warm London night, in a stadium that had gone quiet in a way that stadiums almost never go quiet. He took her hand. He said her name into the microphone. Caroline, just that, her name to 38,000 people. He told the crowd that Caroline had come a long way to be there that night, that she was the reason he did this, that he wanted her to know that every song he played from that point forward was for her. And then he leaned toward her and said something that wasn't into the microphone, something private, something between the two of them that 38,000 people watched being said without hearing a word of it. Caroline nodded. Her face had the expression of someone receiving something they hadn't expected and don't yet have the language to respond to. That particular expression that lives at the intersection of gratitude and disbelief, and something that might be relief. She stayed on stage for 4 songs. During the slower numbers, Michael came back to her side. During She's Out of My Life, one of those songs that exists in a category of its own for what it does to a room that is already emotionally open, he sang the final verse standing directly beside her. And if you know She's Out of My Life, you know what that song does to people under normal circumstances. You know what it does when it's performed by Michael Jackson at the peak of his powers in a stadium full of people who have been cracked open by what they just witnessed. It opened them further. When Caroline was helped back to her seat at the end of the 4th song, the response from the crowd was not applause, not in any ordinary sense of the word. It was the sound of 38,000 people exhaling something they had been holding since the moment she said, "I probably won't be here next year." Something they had been carrying for 4 songs and hadn't had a place to put down until now. Michael stood at the edge of the stage and watched her go, not performing, not transitioning to the next element of the show, just standing there in the middle of what had just happened, letting it be what it was. Then he turned back to the crowd, and he said, "That is why we are all here. That is the only reason any of this exists." He finished the show. Every remaining song landed differently than it would have landed before. The room had been reorganized around a different center of gravity. Something had been revealed that couldn't be unrevealed. And the music, the same songs he'd been playing for 11 months, felt like they were being played for the first time. Now here's something interesting. The people I want to focus on for a moment aren't the crowd. The crowd's reaction makes sense intuitively. You hear something that human and that real, of course you're moved. I want to talk about the professionals. The musicians, the crew, the technical staff. The people who were paid to be there. The people whose whole job was to stay focused and keep the machine running regardless of what the audience was doing. Because what happened to those people is, I think, even more telling. The bass player on that tour was a man named Curtis Webb. He had been touring with Michael for 3 years. He described himself as constitutionally unsentimental. Not in a cold way, just in the way that people who work in live entertainment for long enough tend to become practical about things. You've seen a lot of shows. You've played through technical disasters and personal crises and every variety of unpredictable human moment. You learn to maintain what performers call the fourth wall, the professional separation between what you're doing and what you're feeling. Curtis said that he maintained that separation for approximately the first 2 minutes after Caroline came on stage. And then somewhere around the point where Michael said her name into the microphone, just her name, to 38,000 people, it became no longer available to him. He said he spent the rest of that show on a kind of automatic pilot he had never previously needed to access. Not because he was overwhelmed in a way that affected his playing. The music kept going, the show kept running, but something had shifted underneath the professionalism. He said the difference between a crowd responding to a performance and a crowd responding to something true, that difference, he said, was something he felt in his hands. That the bass he was playing felt different when the room changed. That the vibrations carried something different when 38,000 people moved from the mode of being entertained to the mode of being present. He had never experienced that in 3 years of touring. The lighting director was positioned at the back of the stadium floor with the rest of the technical crew. She had a view that none of the performers on stage had, a full picture of the entire crowd from behind, so she could see every section, every tier, the whole human panorama of 38,000 people in one visual field. She said what she saw from that position during the 4 songs Caroline was on stage was something she had never witnessed in 20 years of working large venues. The quality of attention in the room had changed. Not the direction. Everyone was still looking at the stage, but the nature of that attention had become something different. It was not the attention of an audience watching a show. It was the attention of 38,000 people who had been reminded without warning of something important, something they might have been avoiding or had forgotten or had never quite looked at directly. And they were sitting with that reminder in the specific, quiet way that people sit with things that arrive unexpectedly and are too large to process quickly. She said the room looked from the back like a single organism. Like 38,000 individuals had briefly stopped being individuals and become one body organized around one feeling at one moment. She said she'd been trying to find the words for that image for years and hadn't managed it yet. And the stage crew, the people who broke down the set after the show, the people who loaded the truck and prepped for the next city, the people who were on a schedule and had work to do and did not generally have the luxury of sitting with what a show had meant. Those people worked in near silence that night. Which was unusual. Nobody explained it. Nobody talked about why. They just moved through the work quietly, the way people move through something that has left a mark and they're not quite ready to talk about it yet. The story doesn't end at Wembley. Caroline attended 2 more Michael Jackson concerts before she died the following spring. Michael's team made sure she had front row seats to both. She was met before each show and looked after throughout the evening. She didn't go backstage. She didn't ask for anything beyond what she had originally come for: the music, the room, the specific comfort of being in a space where thousands of people were all feeling the same thing at the same time. That's worth pausing on for a second, because a lot of people in her position might have wanted to meet him, might have wanted a photo or a conversation or some keepsake. Caroline didn't. What she wanted was the experience itself. The music and the room and the feeling of being part of something larger than one life. That's what she came back for. After Caroline died, her sister wrote a letter to Michael's management. The letter described the Wembley night in detail, what it had meant to Caroline, what she had said about it in the months that followed, how she had returned to it in the last weeks, when returning to things was most of what remained available to her. And in that letter, the sister wrote something that I think is one of the most precise descriptions of what that night gave to Caroline that I've encountered. She wrote that Caroline had told her the Wembley night made her feel, for the first time since her diagnosis, that her life had a scale to it, that she was not a small thing happening in a corner somewhere, that 38,000 people knew her name, that the most famous entertainer in the world had held her hand on a stage and told her she was the reason he did this. Let that land for a moment. One of the things that serious illness does, one of the cruelest things, is that it shrinks the world. It reduces the radius of your life. The places you can go, the things you can do, the future you can plan for, all of it contracts. And with that contraction comes a particular kind of invisibility, a feeling of becoming smaller and smaller while the world keeps moving at its normal size around you. What happened at Wembley did something very specific to that feeling. It reversed it. For one night, Caroline's world expanded to fill a stadium. 38,000 people turned their full attention toward her. The most famous performer in the world stopped everything to see her specifically, and then told 38,000 strangers her name and invited them to do the same. She died knowing she had been seen. Her sister ended the letter with a line that Michael kept. A line that was found years later in a folder at Neverland with dozens of similar letters. Letters from families, from hospitals, from people whose names had briefly intersected with his life in ways that never made the front page and were never intended to. She wrote, "She died knowing she had been seen. I don't know how to thank you for that. I don't think there are words for it, but I wanted you to know." I want to talk about that folder for a second, because I think it matters to the way we understand Michael Jackson, and I think it's largely unknown. The public record of Michael Jackson is enormous and complicated. We know the music, obviously. We know every album, every chart position, every record broken. We know the spectacle of the live shows. We know the tabloid stories, the lawsuits, the controversies that followed him for decades. We know the isolation and the strangeness and the tragedy of the last years of his life. What we know less about is the quiet part. The folder at Neverland. The letters. The evidence of a life lived significantly in the space between the performances, in the rooms and corridors and private moments that never made the news because they were never intended to be news. Michael visited children's hospitals regularly throughout his life. Not for photo opportunities, not for the press. There are documented accounts of him arriving unannounced, spending hours with kids who were seriously ill, sitting at bedsides, holding hands, bringing gifts, listening. His Heal the World Foundation, which he established in 1992, raised tens of millions of dollars for children's charities and disaster relief. He personally funded a significant portion of it. He donated large amounts of his tour revenue to charitable causes throughout his career, and he did it without the kind of publicist-driven announcement that most celebrities use to make their giving visible. He wrote in letters and in interviews about the specific comfort he took in being around children, not for any sinister reason, as his detractors would claim, but because children, he said, hadn't yet learned to see him the way adults saw him. They hadn't absorbed the mythology. They saw the person rather than the phenomenon. And for someone who had been famous since he was 5 years old, who had spent essentially his entire life as a kind of cultural object rather than a human being, the experience of being seen as a person rather than a symbol was rare and precious. The Wembley moment, the Caroline moment, is consistent with all of this. What Michael did that night wasn't a performance of compassion. It wasn't calculated. The show was running. The set list was on schedule. The crowd was giving everything a performer could ask for. There was no reason, in terms of show business logic, to stop everything for one woman in the 6th row. He stopped everything for one woman in the 6th row because he saw her. Because that's what he actually did. He looked at 38,000 people, and he saw the one who needed to be seen the most. And having seen her, he couldn't unsee her. And having responded, he couldn't unrespond. That's not a performance, that's a character. And I think that distinction matters, especially now, decades later, when Michael Jackson's legacy exists in a complicated space that makes it difficult for a lot of people to engage with him at all. I'm not interested in adjudicating that complexity here. What I'm interested in is this. The character that showed up at Wembley on July 16, 1988, was not the character of a person who was performing generosity for an audience. It was the character of a person who genuinely could not let someone be invisible when he had the power to make them seen. The crew members who worked in silence loading the truck that night weren't processing a great stage moment. They were processing something true. And the difference between those two things, between a great performance and something true, was something the bass player felt in his hands. The lighting director still hasn't found the words for what the room looked like from the back during those 4 songs. Some things live beyond the reach of language. A version of this story that ends at Wembley. 38,000 people, a dying woman, a famous performer, a beautiful moment. A thing that happened on a warm night in London in 1988, and then was filed away in the archive of things that are moving but also distant. But the version that actually happened is different. The version that actually happened ends with a sister writing a letter, with Michael keeping that letter, with a folder full of similar letters, evidence of a life lived quietly and significantly in the spaces between the headlines. With Caroline dying the following spring, knowing her life had a scale to it, knowing she wasn't a small thing happening in a corner. I think about what it took for Caroline to say what she said into that microphone. She didn't have to tell the truth. She could have said something safe, something deflecting. She could have said, "I'm doing great, this is amazing, thank you so much." She chose instead to say something true, something that cost something to say, something that she knew once it was in that microphone would be heard by 38,000 people and would change the temperature of the room. She chose honesty, and that honesty, as it turned out, was the thing that made everything else possible. It was the thing that gave 38,000 strangers a reason to hold each other. We talk a lot, in the context of art and performance and music, about the power of a song, about the way a lyric can unlock something in you, about the way a voice can make a feeling that was private suddenly feel shared. What happened at Wembley was something related to that, but different. It wasn't a song. It was a moment. One person saying something true, one person responding with everything at his disposal, and 38,000 people discovering, without being asked, without being instructed, that they were capable of organizing themselves around one feeling at one moment and holding it together. That is why we go to concerts. That is why we put on records. That is why we sit in the dark with thousands of strangers and let ourselves feel things in public. Because sometimes the room does something to you that you couldn't do alone. Sometimes the scale of the shared experience is what makes the individual experience possible. Sometimes you need 38,000 people to be present with you in order to feel, for the first time, that your life is not small. Caroline knew that. She went back twice more because she knew it, and she died with it. The rest of us, most of us, are lucky enough not to need it as urgently as she did. But it's still true for all of us. The capacity to be seen, the capacity to see, the capacity of a room full of strangers to become, briefly, one thing. That's why the story matters. That's why I think it's worth telling. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first came across it, drop a comment down below and tell me what part got you. I read every single one of them, genuinely. And if you want more stories like this, moments that happened in public but somehow managed to stay real, subscribe. I find them. I sit with them for a while before I bring them here because I think they deserve that, and I think you deserve to hear them. Share this one with someone you think needs it today. You probably know exactly who that person is. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.